Hi, so just to say thank you so much for joining us today for this virtual session at the World Bank's Innovate for Climate, entitled Climate Finance, How to Leverage the Peace Dividend. My name is Catherine Wong. I'm team leader for climate and security risk at UNDP, and I'm delighted to open this session and offer a few framing remarks on behalf of the organizers of this session. So the Climate Security Mechanism, the Green Growth Knowledge Partnerships Green Finance Platform, and UNDP. Last year, we conducted a study together with the Climate Security Mechanism, which examined some $14 billion of climate finance implemented through the climate change vertical funds in 146 countries, including 56 fragile states, and over the period 2014 to 2021. And this study showed that conflict-affected and fragile contexts are some of the lowest recipients of climate finance. Now, there are special considerations for least developed countries and for small island developing states as well, many of which also suffer from access to climate finance. However, from this study, we do see the importance of highlighting the specific context of countries which are suffering from conflict and fragility. And this is because on the one hand, conflict and fragility can be an obstacle to climate action. And on the other hand, in context of scarcity, climate change adaptation can help reduce pressure on natural resources, and access to energy that renewables affords in conflict-affected contexts can be a lifeline which makes all other types of services, including basic and emergency services possible. We also know that conflict and fragility cut across all income levels. So around 70% of fragile states are LDCs, and around 50% of LDCs overall are also included in the World Bank's a harmonized list of fragile states. Our study shows that there are distinct gaps and differences that are noted in the way that conflict and fragility affect climate finance on the one hand and access to it. And then on the other, how implementation of climate finance may also interact with other drivers of fragility and insecurity. I just want to share with you a couple of the kind of headline findings from this study. If we're looking at the top 20 fragile state recipients of climate finance, only 2 of these countries were extremely fragile. If we're taking a per capita look at climate finance in conflict-affected and fragile contexts, we find that non-fragile states, including the SIDS, received $161.7 per person in climate finance over the period 2014 to 2021. Fragile states, on the other hand, received just $10.8 per person, and extremely fragile, $2.1 per person. So these are just a few key facts. As we before, we look to our experts for nuance, for solutions and ways forward in terms of the overall objectives of the session, which are to focus on trends in access to climate finance in conflict-affected and fragile contexts, gaps and opportunities to leverage the peace and security co-benefits, or also called peace dividends of climate finance, and specifically climate change adaptation, but also access to energy. We hope that our experts will also be able to weigh in on strategies for mainstreaming climate risk of peace and security into climate finance, and their lessons learned and recommendations for how to make climate finance work better for conflict-affected and fragile contexts. In this regard, I'm delighted to hand over to our moderator for the session, Dr. Coco Warner. She is an expert herself on climate change risks, impacts, and resilience at the UNFCCC Secretariat. She leads the Vulnerability Subdivision, where she guides the Global Adaptation Knowledge to Action Hub and the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. Coco is a lead author of various IPCC reports, including the latest 6th assessment report, and before joining the Secretariat, she founded and served as Executive Director of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative and Scientific Director of the Environmental Migration and Social Resilience at UN University in Bonn. Coco, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. And it's great to not exactly see you all, but it's wonderful to be here and take part in this important discussion about climate finance and its potential to help catalyze a peace dividend. And so I'll be moderating today's discussion. Let me just do a little bit of expectation management. So you as an audience and also our panelists know approximately the phases of our discussion today. We're going to start out with a really marvelous panel of 3 speakers, very distinguished, and you'll meet them in just a minute. Between about 45 minutes past the hour until just before the hour, we'll be able to engage with you as an audience. And so as you're listening, do feel free to put your questions in the chat box. Then we'll be able to moderate that and as much as possible. I'm sure there will be far more questions than there is time to address, but understanding your questions also is a big contribution to this really important topic. And then right towards the hour, I'll turn the time back to Catherine Wong, who will summarize the discussion, and then you'll be off to the rest of your day. So to get started, I'd love to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists who are Ambassador Ahmed Abdel Latif, who is Director General of the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peace Building. And I'll provide just a few more highlights of his career in just a moment. And we're also joined by Ms. Camilla Bourne, who's Deputy Director for Climate Finance in the UK Cabinet Office. And then Mr. Dane McQueen, who is Director of Programs and Partnerships and is also part of the COP28 incoming presidency that will be next year. He's a Senior Advisor for Development and Humanitarian Affairs with the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. So you can tell we have an absolutely star-studded panel to talk about this topic of climate finance and what climate finance can contribute to peace and stability. We're in a moment now, as we have been for a long time, but if we just focus on the types of disruptions that we're experiencing right now around the world, we have a conflict going on here in Europe. We see headlines almost every day about disruptions of supply chains, particularly very concerning food supply chains. So even though that conflict is happening in a spatial and geographical area, it affects all people of the world, and most concerningly, households, and particularly people who are really in a fragile, delicate situation. It doesn't stop with finance. There's been extreme heat on the subcontinent of Africa, forest fires, alternating snow and heat waves, grain shortfalls, and those are just some of the weather-related and possibly climate change-related impacts. So it's really a moment when all of us at home feel some of these destabilizing impacts. And so now we're going to elevate the discussion and start turning to our panelists. So Ambassador Abdel Latif, perhaps I can just say a few more things to introduce you. And what I'll do is just pose one question to get the discussion started. We'll go through our panelists, and before you know it, we'll already be to the audience discussion. Ambassador Latif, as I said, is Director General of the CCCPA. He's a career diplomat with the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's also a well-publicized author. He holds advanced degrees from the London School of Economics and Political Science, the American University of Cairo, Sciences Po in Paris, and the Egyptian Institute of Diplomatic Studies. Ambassador Latif, Egypt is a leader in complex negotiation situations. Egypt has championed post-conflict resolution and development in the African Union and is launching the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development, or did that in 2019. Egypt will also be hosting the UNFCCC climate negotiations COP27 this year in November in 2022. So you just see so much leadership, so much expertise on the world stage. So from your perspective, Ambassador, what opportunities do you see for Egypt and this tremendous leadership potential? What potential do you see for progress on climate finance and stability? Please.
Thank you, Coco Warner. A pleasure to see you, and thank you also, UNDP, Catherine, for the invitation to address this important panel discussion. I think, as you mentioned, Egypt is hosting the COP this year, and maybe just to say a few words about Egyptian priorities in that regard. As you mentioned, we are going through a very volatile international situation with disruptions in energy and commodities markets, unfolding global food crisis, energy crisis, added to it already the challenges that we face in the area of peace and security. At the same time, almost concurrently, we had two IPCC reports, one on adaptation and vulnerability, the other on mitigation, that really once again highlight the importance of urgent action to address climate change. So we need to really take all of these challenges together, and this is what we're trying to do. In the context of COP27, Egypt's priority, just to give the broad framing, is on implementation. This is a COP about implementation of global pledges, those from the Paris Agreement until the Glasgow Pact last year. Implementation across all areas, including mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance. And particularly on finance, this has been a long Egyptian priority, and we're stressing on the importance of accelerating the delivery of the $100 billion that were pledged at the Paris Agreement, and to also to make progress towards doubling climate adaptation finance on 2019 levels as envisaged in the Glasgow Climate Pact. In addition to that, Egypt will be planning to launch a number of initiatives that contribute to advancing the implementation of these commitment, and they will pertain to a number of different areas, as different as adaptation, agriculture, waste, and other areas. As you know, Egypt has been particularly engaged in strengthening climate action and climate cooperation, particularly in the context of the priorities of Africa, and it will continue to do so. So this is a bit the broad framing of the COP, and at the same time, Egypt, as you mentioned, is a champion of peace building, very active internationally also on peace and security. And ahead of the COP this year, we will have the third edition of the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development, which will take place on 21st, 22nd of June. And in that context, we will address also the interface between climate change, peace, and peace, and particularly with a focus on peace building. And in the context of preparing to the Aswan Forum, we already had a workshop a couple of months ago on the issue of scaling up climate finance for peace. And the summary of that workshop is available online, and it comes in the conjunction of the efforts by others. UNDP did a great report that was issued a couple of 1 or 2 months later, and I think we're all recognizing that this is an important issue. That if you take already Africa only receives 4% of global climate finance, and even of that 4%, it's mostly mitigation, very little towards adaptation. So there's a general problem of accessing climate finance for many conflict affected countries, and even then more so to ensuring that this finance has peace dividends incorporated in it. And there's different, I leave to others to discuss the different options to do that, and to how to make that work. It's an important conversation that we will also address at the Aswan Forum, but also in the context of a broader conversation about financing peace, development, and climate. Because as I said, we're facing multiple crises at the same time. The resources are limited, so how can we ensure to make the best out of each of these different streams? Just to add, that Egypt has been a strong advocate of also increasing finance peace building, peace building finance. And I think it's important here, and there's a high level meeting of the General Assembly that took place a couple of weeks ago that gave momentum to this, in particular for sustained predictable financing of peace building, including in terms of accessing assessed contributions. And we think it's very important to keep that momentum. And while the discussion on making climate finance more also incorporating more the peace dimension, we should also not to be at the expense of the momentum and of the importance of increasing peace building finance. So this is also part of how we see this discussion. And we will see then the discussions around that from the Aswan Forum going to COP. How can they contribute to also addressing that issue in COP, where already climate finance is a big priority, as I mentioned. I will stop here, not to take more time, and happy to revert back to some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you so much. It's clear you have a very comprehensive set of aims that you're aiming for. Wishing you all a lot of luck this year. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that we'll circle back. Just a quick housekeeping announcement. For those of you who are not speakers, would you be so kind to mute your microphones? That'll be really helpful. Would like to turn now to Ms. Camilla Bourne. I announced before that Camilla is Deputy Director for Climate Finance in the COP26 presidency. That's with the UK Cabinet. Camilla is a prized policy advisor, and it's a huge privilege to have all of our three COP presidencies here present. Of course, the current COP presidency, COP26, for those of you who are in Glasgow. Camilla was formerly a senior policy advisor in E3G's climate diplomacy, risk and security team, focusing on delivering high leverage political interventions to shape transformational international outcomes. And Camilla, you're a very familiar face in the climate negotiations and of course in so many of the networks. Your expertise spans security, climate negotiations, as I just mentioned, and climate finance. From your perspective, what opportunities do you see for amplifying climate finance in ways that can aim towards this stability or peace dividend?
Thanks. Definitely not an easy question.
Not an easy question.
But a very good one, and something that we are going to have to learn to grapple with more and more as the years wear on, and we see increasing, protracted and intersecting crises, as the last speaker was just touching on. I think particularly around adaptation financing, it's one of the reasons that I was so pleased that we were able to broker agreement around a doubling of adaptation finance. There is a huge opportunity there to invest that adaptation finance in a way that helps to build resilience and to limit the likelihood of cascade risks. I think a lot of time has been spent trying to think, does climate change equal conflict? And I always find it a little bizarre in some ways, because it's not like we spend any time on other issues saying, does X equal Y conflict? It's an unnecessary conversation in many ways to focus too much on. And instead, we should be thinking, if climate change is this risk multiplier, which I think most of us agree that it is, and we see that it is in many, many different contexts, then what can we do to be able to minimize some of those risks? So some of that might be through adaptation, so ensuring that the access to food, I think the food crisis is one thing that is certainly a factor, and climate change is very present in that. If we look at the recent examples in India having experiencing extreme drought and now deciding to have to protect its own food security, that is something that of course will have global implications, and that's the kind of patterns that we might expect to see elsewhere, and something that we're going to have to learn to navigate singularly, together, bilaterally, multilaterally, etc., over the coming years. And I think adaptation has a big role to play. There is also a role for climate mitigation financing. One of the areas where there is a lot of crossover is particularly around the use of diesel generators. So diesel is often an area where there is a lot of theft and there's a lot of trade in diesel, which also sometimes has crossover with fueling financially some of the terrorist or otherwise organizations that intersect with conflict. And so in one way, trying to replace those kind of generators with renewables alternatives is one way of limiting that in a very kind of acute sense. More broadly, there is some evidence out there, and it's growing, that decentralized renewables, because of the decentralized nature, they really do help to provide widespread employment in different regions, in different spaces, and that is also a really important factor in stabilization and ensuring that people have sustainable livelihoods that enable them to move themselves out of the precarity of a conflict or post-conflict situation. So there is a lot of potential to be able to ensure that climate interventions are something that help us to build peace, and something that perhaps is challenging to do. It's not straightforward, but something that will intersect widely with the progress that we're expecting to see as climate finance increases and is rolled out, particularly in the area of adaptation.
Thanks so much, Camilla. And I understand that you might not be able to stay for the entirety of the session due to another obligation. Could I follow up with one question? Both you and the ambassador have mentioned these complementary areas. For example, just now, Camilla, you were talking about very specific things, livelihood stability, people being able to work and have the power that they need to power their livelihoods. I also understand in a limited way that when a financial institution, or let's say a government, creates climate finance, that there are certain maybe buckets of money or certain guidelines on that climate finance, and they're often sectoral or along ministerial lines. So here's my question, Camilla, with all of your experience, are there a few areas where you see progress being made so that public finance, for example, or private finance can meet the obligations that it has towards its either the public, taxpayers, or the financial institution, and also start to get some of these synergies that might not normally fit in a particular bucket or silo? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, climate change in and of itself doesn't really mean anything until climate change starts interacting with other things that different people, different parts of the economy, different societies and cultures depend on and care about. And I think that's one of the challenges when an issue becomes mainstream, because climate needs to be integrated into the way that we do stabilization. There are some studies that show that, for example, a lot of stabilization financing in some post-conflict situations has been channeled to help in the agricultural sector, which is a very good place to provide the kind of employment that I was talking about, which is incredibly important. But it hasn't been always done with a climate risk lens in mind. And so some of that agriculture that has been invested in, sadly, is not fit for purpose as the world starts to warm. And then you create a kind of feedback loop of destabilizing factors, because you're taking away that kind of employment and that kind of livelihood support that is maintaining stability in some communities. So it will be really important to, one, bring climate to some of the levers of peace and security that we have at our disposal, and on the flip side, bring an understanding of peace and security to the climate outcomes that we need to be able to try and facilitate. And I think something that is a challenge is that the way the incentives that are aligned for different institutions and different funding mechanisms are not so good at doing that kind of nexus financing. It is a tricky thing to pull off. And I think it's something that we're going to have to improve and get better at. It will be a period of trial and error to some extent, because we've never lived in a world before that is warming in the way that it is. And so it's something we're going to have to learn by doing. It's something that we're going to have to experiment with, be innovative, but there is a huge amount of potential for delivering multiple benefits and outcomes. But I do think this is exactly one of the reasons that we sometimes struggle to do it, because if we are trying to, cut as emissions as much as possible, protect the largest amount of people as possible, those kind of indicators don't always align. Sometimes they do, but they don't always align with peace and security ones. And we're going to have to think more agilely at how we move into that situation so that we can ensure that we're using financing to be able to be as effective as possible in supporting people and making those right choices that do help to facilitate peace.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate those thoughts. Let's move on to our third panelist. And then for all of you as audience members, good news for you, after Dane, we're going to be able to interact just a little bit more. But let me introduce Dane McQueen. As I said before, Dane McQueen is a senior advisor in the Office of the United Arab Emirates Special Envoy for Climate Change in Abu Dhabi. Dane is working to set up the COP28 presidency, as well as the senior advisor for development and humanitarian affairs at the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. So much to say about you and your career, Dane, but perhaps because everyone wants to interact with you, as well as the ambassador and Camilla, as long as you can stay with us, perhaps I could just dive into the question. The UAE has assumed its elected seat on the UN Security Council in January of this year. And in March of this year, the UAE hosted the first ever meeting of council members on climate finance. The UAE will serve as the next year's COP28 presidency following Egypt. So much going on. From your area of expertise, I also understand that fragile states needs to be part of the equation. So a question for you, Dane, could you say a word about what kind of approach could help improve stability for fragile areas that face both climate change impacts as well as finance and security challenges?
Thank you so much, Coco, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me and for also putting fragility at the top of the agenda on the first day. It's also quite an honor to be here with Egypt and the UK and to show this continuity between presidencies, which is very much a goal of ours. So just from an Emirati experience, we first really encountered this interplay between climate and fragility and vulnerability as a humanitarian donor and obviously as a country in our region. And just, this huge volume of quite haunting testimonials from people in frontline communities, disproportionately women as well, talking about droughts and floods and locusts and terrorism recruitment and all of it basically coming from food and water shortages and the aftermath of climate stress and disasters. And when we joined the Security Council and when we started preparing for COP28, we encountered even greater volume of these destabilization pieces of evidence. And again, a very, very strong relationship to food and water conditions in those countries that had been undermined by climate change. And so, from both of these portfolios, we were increasingly seeing, the actions recommended for conflict prevention and the actions recommended under climate action being the same. And so we've, very much been looking at how do you integrate these approaches using the kind of multilateral mechanisms that we're involved in. And there's maybe been somewhat of an overfocus on the Security Council as the place to address climate security issues. And we've been really pleased to see that there is better data and better reporting. You have experts, climate experts, now embedded in a number of peacekeeping missions who are making those, connecting the dots and explaining to security actors how this is working. But I think what really crystallized it for us was the UNDP report, with your headline statistic of $2 of climate finance per capita reaching highly fragile countries, despite the fact that we all know how transformative, more money, more investment would be, particularly in food and water. So, with the remainder of our time on the council and certainly with the COP28 presidency, we want to basically enable or force a political conversation. I think, there's a recognition that we have a problem. Many people know this, there has to be more investment, but how much and how do you do it? And we're really fortunate that we're following from Glasgow, where you had a doubling of adaptation commitment, which really helped to put the issue on the agenda. And now Egypt has this extremely welcome and timely focus on adaptation, and particularly African countries as well. We do want to set some parameters. We don't want this to be a wedge issue among developing countries where there's a zero-sum game on international assistance. This needs to be additional. It can't be reallocation away from other developing countries, and it shouldn't be a double counting exercise as well. But what we'd like to do is put together, and not us, but through these multilateral mechanisms, put together a very practical set of investments in a country platform. So what are the drought resistant crops and improved irrigation and water management boards, and all these smaller nitty gritty things that need to be done, and see how you can put them into an overall investment package. And how do you make it gender sensitive and conflict sensitive, et cetera. And then really, I think, we have to address the finance question. Are we going to shoot for a dollar figure on the amount that's spent on fragile countries? Is it a percentage of portfolios from IFIs? Does it get incorporated into the post-2025 financing goal? Are we going to ask MDBs to change their risk appetite so that they are willing to put money into these countries that they're usually not? Or are we going to have requirements where a peace program has to be signed off by climate experts and vice versa? And I think one of the potentially very interesting things to talk about too over the next year is whether we can apply this concept of the just energy transition partnerships, which are focused on moving countries from coal to clean energy. Can we apply something similar in the adaptation space? And really do something at scale, and maybe even starting with a pilot at COP27 and more countries by COP28 and COP29 and COP30. We don't have we definitely don't have an answer, and but at this point we would like to use our Security Council term and our presidency of the COP process to help advance the conversation and focus more on these concrete deliverables. So, from our point of view, this is one of the most strategic investments that we can make from both a peace and climate point of view. And we'd be really proud if our roles in the council and the presidency could contribute to some more concrete outcome. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists, Ambassador, Camilla, and also Dane. The audience is free to put questions in the chat. And we have a lot of introductions. So perhaps I will, here we go. Here's one question from Lewis. And Lewis doesn't indicate who, so I will leave this open to all three panelists, and any of you can address this. But Lewis asks the question, what are some current approaches that are happening in the world applied to integrating climate finance and issues like drought? Dane, you mentioned water. I wonder if you have one or two examples of things that are actually happening now that might attract climate finance. Right at the end, you mentioned a few examples. What would a just transition look like for food or water?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe Catherine wants to chime in on this, but some of the examples that we typically cite, are around water management in fragile communities where there's also drought. And so setting up, a community board where you have representatives, particularly from herders and farmers, who can work out how water is allocated among communities, and then also how you increase water supply, and efficiency of water use in those communities to take a little bit of strain off the supply side. And then obviously there's also been some good work on kind of measuring where fragility is highest and using that as a prioritization tool for where to do these kind of interventions. So maybe just two examples off the top of my head.
Yeah, thanks so much. Here's the question, Camilla. I'm going to address this to you. This is from Hendry in Indonesia. Camilla, you had mentioned just in passing indicators or markers or key performance indicators. And Henry is asking for some insights about what would some meaningful indicators be for climate finance. And he mentions environment, you had mentioned also development and stability. What would these new indicators look like for climate finance?
So I think the challenge is that it is often context specific. So there's some obvious markers and indicators that you might have, like the highest potential for emissions reductions, or the amount of people that are protected, or a percentage of the economy, or a volume of the economy that's being protected through a certain set of investments. But I don't think those indicators for prevention of spillover effects related to peace and security are so readily available. And one way that you may need to try and create those incentives would be to experiment with those kind of indicators and understand where they might have impact. I think traditionally they wouldn't be seen as climate related benefits necessarily. And that's part of the challenge. So then how do you blend finance from the climate world and also the peace and security world? So you're making sure that stabilization financing is done in such a way that it secures and supports climate outcomes, but also you ensure that climate financing supports and delivers peace and security outcomes. And I think that is really part of the challenge that we face. And so we'd have to try and establish that and create those set of incentives to do it, because at the moment, especially given the challenges associated with doing financing in fragile and conflict affected states, it doesn't always seem the kind of normative thing to get that money out the door. I think one of the challenges that donor countries are having now is we're rising to the challenge of the task of doubling adaptation finance. But if we're able to secure that and do that in time to fulfill the doubling target by 2025, that means we need to get the finance flowing quickly. And peace and security layered on top of that is another hurdle and makes it slower. So we have to be a little careful about how we make sure that the incentives are there so that we can effectively deliver the most high impact outcomes, recognizing that they might not all be climate alone. Not that climate alone really exists. Read my previous comment that climate is really about how it affects the other things that people, states, economies, communities care about.
Thank you. That leads to, in some ways, a cluster of questions. And Lucas, Ryan, and Stevie, I hope that, pardon me, I'm putting your questions together. And this question is about what I'm calling an enabling environment, institutional frameworks or rules or laws or policies. And Ambassador Abdel Latif, if you'd like to weigh in, welcome, or Dane or Camilla. And I think the question is, what kind of framework helps facilitate this alignment that Camilla was just talking about, so that finance, including climate finance, accelerates moves towards stability, and then also that you get stability, perhaps even unlocking climate finance for these areas of adaptation or others. For the ambassador, or also Dane and Camilla, what kind of institutional considerations need to be in place, particularly since we've been talking about fragile states and fragile circumstances where some of those very institutions are really under a lot of pressure. Any thoughts from the panel?
If I can just mention it, I think in the workshop we had, and we prepared for this discussions in the Aswan Forum, I mean, in these discussions, there's the idea to create special mechanism to address the needs of fragile countries in climate finance. And this is something that is out there among different reports and discussions. And I think it can be thought of and further research. But what we found, I mean, when we did this meeting, we brought together climate finance experts with peace building finance experts. And it was fascinating to see that it was maybe the first time that they talked to each other. And the climate finance negotiators, and they had this dimension of the peace dividends was for them relatively new and very interesting, and they were very interested about it. And same thing on the other side. So I think there is a lot of mutual learning to be developed between these communities, and to understand where the entry points, where the synergies, how can things in the way they exist currently be better maximized in terms of resources, in terms of synergies, before going to further steps around that. And I think there is scope to do this in different settings, and in forums such as the Aswan Forum, for example, or other venues where we can increase the socialization and this mutual understanding between these communities before going to the need of creating a new mechanism or new entities or new arrangements, because already the conversations on these issues are quite complicated in their existing settings, and I think it's important to bear in mind and not to detract from the focus of also, again, increasing adaptation finance, for example, on building on the pledge for Glasgow, and knowing that adaptation finance and adaptation has potentially, if well designed, very important dividends for peace building in particular. And it's this peace building adaptation nexus that we want to particularly focus on in Aswan Forum. Thank you.
So much to talk about. Ambassador, thank you very, very much. Also, Dane and Camilla, and maybe especially to our very wonderful audience. Now we have 10 or 12 questions in the chat box, and I just got a time management note from our hosts. And so perhaps as a final adieu from our panelists, with all of those thanks and with all of the respect and honor, Ambassador, Camilla, Dane, if you were going to depart with one thing that you'd like this really active and terrific audience of, it looks like about 120 plus people, where would you like them to focus when it comes to climate finance and the nexus with stability and peace? If you wanted us to go off and do our homework, where would you ask us to focus? And then after that, over to you, Catherine. It's been wonderful to be with you all. Ambassador, Camilla, Dane, last word.
I'm going to jump in first because I have to jump off, I'm afraid. What I would say is join forces. That's my main message, which is bring climate people together with peace and security people together with climate people, disaster risk reduction people, whatever works. Get people together around a geography, around a moment, whatever it is, and understand what you're both looking for in terms of outcomes. And the highly likelihood is that you can bring those things together, and then you can more effectively deliver on that and attract more resources. We have to start proving that this is possible for it to become normalized. And as the ambassador was saying, we don't want to get into a situation where we're just ad infinitum tweaking at institutions in a way that's not delivering. So I think get practical, get crunchy, work together. That's my residing message. And thank you for convening this, Catherine. It's been excellent. And thank you for excellent chairing, Coco. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much, Camilla.
Sure, I'll jump in then. So similar message. I think really the kind of political buzz around fragility, it would be one of the most important factors at this point. There's been very good work to establish SIDS and LDCs and other categories. Let's also start talking about fragile states as a key consideration in all climate work. And then I think also just getting more granular, like what are those food and water and resilience investments that we need to talk about, just to unpack this concept of climate security and make it more about, very specific projects that are in the communities. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dane. Ambassador?
Thank you. I think it has been mentioned, but I think it's important to emphasize again, and maybe something when I talked about this mutual learning, the language is not the same also. The language we use is not the same across these different streams of financing, these different communities. So we need to socialize ourselves about this language and how we can create a common language around this community that understands each other and that can work and that recognizes the specific challenges facing conflict-affected countries in fragility, and also bearing in mind that, and this is something I would like to stress to final in my final remarks, that as I mentioned at the beginning, the challenges are interconnected. These countries face peace and security challenges, with climate challenges, with food security challenges, with water challenges, and the responses need to be interconnected. And across these different cascading risks, whether peace, whether climate, whether food security. So we need to have holistic and integrated responses in any case when we are having this discussion. I'll stop here. And thank you very much. Appreciate very much the opportunity to have this conversation and to see also good friends such as Dane and also the UK. We have been working closely with also with the COPs 26 and 27 presidency, and now forthcoming 28 COP presidency. And I think there's a good momentum around these issues among all the three countries. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ahmed. Thank you, Dane. Thank you, Camilla. And very many thanks to our excellent moderator, Coco, too. I see we've got 2 minutes left. So just in quick summary, I think our esteemed panelists really highlighted, first of all, the need to deliver on climate finance commitments, and in particular, our commitments related to adaptation. I think a very important point was made in terms of causality. We're not talking about a causal link between climate and conflict here. What we are talking about are countries that have to address simultaneously the climate emergency and also conflict and fragility. And in the case of climate finance, conflict and fragility matter. I think it was also important, the point that was raised about other types of finance. We need to consider and to make the best out of each finance stream and to work in both directions, making sure that we are climate proofing prevention, peace building and stabilization finance, and making sure that our nature, climate and energy investments are fit for purpose and do contribute to multiple benefits and outcomes too as well. I think there were some really interesting points raised about targets and the need to perhaps maybe find a dollar figure amount or a specific allocation for conflict affected and fragile contexts, to reconsider our risk appetite and also make sure that we include requirements for peace and security consideration in terms of the allocation of climate finance. I think that the idea of having an approach as we do for just transition and applying that at scale to adaptation, I think is very timely as well. And then to the final points that were made by colleagues just now as well, in terms of bringing together climate and peace building finance experts. I think we have a very timely opportunity with the AS1 forum next month, also focusing on climate change and sustaining peace. So would invite colleagues as well to check out this opportunity. With regards to what we can do in terms of water security, please do check out our website, Climate Promise at UNDP, for some of our work in this space. Just to say thanks so much again. This was an excellent session. Due to the panelists, the moderation and the audience too. Thank you so much for joining us.